he's going to give us the actual presentation for the day. So turn it over to Paul. Great.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, it's exciting to do this interdisciplinary sponsored event, and great to see everybody out. So just a couple words about the Office for Public Culture. It's a new project being developed with support from the Brooks College of Interdisciplinary Studies. And essentially, it's a project that just looks at culture as a central component in society, and then tries to kind of investigate that, research that, and then eventually develop some projects that help move public discourse forward. So if you're interested in any of that, get in touch with me, and I'll get you involved in the development of the project as it evolves. Jason.
Hey, my name is Jason Adams. I'm an adjunct professor in Department of Communication here at Grand Valley. It's my great honor here today to introduce today's speaker, the Wayne State University professor and extremely influential author and cultural critic, Stephen Shaviro. It's a testament to Shaviro's interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary significance that today's talk is co-sponsored by so many different colleges, schools, and departments throughout Grand Valley, including the Brooks College for Interdisciplinary Studies, the School of Communications, Office for Public Culture, and the Philosophy Department. Shaviro's own work, appropriately enough, itself spans numerous disciplines. Though he teaches in the English department at Wayne State, his work engages a wide range of fields, including film theory, literary theory, cultural studies, political economy, critical philosophy, science and technology studies, race, class, and gender studies, and of course, critical theory. Shaviro is one of the most influential critics in the United States and probably in the world as well. In fact, last year when when I was contacting him to put together this talk, he was already in the midst of all kinds of requests to give talks in Brazil, in London, and the UK, in Europe, and things like that. And this year, when we finally got around to doing it, it was very much the same kind of scenario. Shaviro is the author of numerous influential books, including The Cinematic Body in Film Studies, Connected, or What It Means to Live in the Network Society, Without Criteria, Kant, Whitehead, The Losing Aesthetics, and Post-Cinematic Affect. He's got several more coming soon too, and the one to come most shortly is The Universe of Things. Shaviro's engagement with critical and radical philosophers and theorists has been also quite extensive, including writings on the works of such thinkers as Gilles Deleuze, Alfred North Whitehead, Karl Marx, Georges Bataille, Immanuel Kant, Maurice Blanchot, and many others. So today's talk is entitled Accelerationism, an Introduction. And so without further ado, I'll allow Stephen Shaviro to introduce that.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Thanks to Jason and Andrew and everybody else who had a role in bringing me here. I should say before I begin that this is the first time I've lived in Michigan for almost a decade, but this is the first time I've ever been to Grand Rapids. And I didn't have the time this afternoon, unfortunately, to go to the Gerald Ford Museum, though I wanted to. But even though it has nothing to do with my talk, I had to share an anecdote, which is, I read this in an obituary when Ford died, which was, I'm old enough to have lived through and to remember, I've been old enough then to remember the Nixon years. And of course, Gerald Ford was often much criticized for his pardon of Nixon. But apparently what the story was is that for his entire life after he left the presidency, Gerald Ford always carried around a legal document in his wallet. And the legal document stated, and probably this is true, I'm not a legal expert, but I'm told this is true, that to accept a pardon means to acknowledge guilt. And that if you claim you were actually innocent of crimes, he couldn't accept a pardon. So I thought I was moved to see that Gerald Ford, kept that in his pocket for all the rest of his life. Okay, that has really nothing to do, but I mean, but Gerald Ford is really the only association I had with Grand Rapids before coming here this morning. Okay. So my talk is Accelerationism and Introduction, and basically, So accelerationism is a word that has come up recently, and I want to talk mostly about what it means. A lot of this will just be sort of summarizing what the word and its use and its implications. At the end, hopefully I'll get to a little bit about my own attitude or position for it, but I'm much more concerned to just sort of lay out the arguments pro and con and give you an idea of what this word means and why it's suddenly become, or in the last couple of years, something which is, at least in some circles, is much debated. Okay. In his science fiction novel, Pop Apocalypse, Lee Constantinou imagines the existence of what he calls a creative destruction school of Marxist-Leninist thought. The adherents of the creative destruction school, and this is a quote from the novel, interpret Marx's writings as literal predictions of the future, so they consider it their mission to help capitalist markets spread to every corner of the world, because that's the necessary precondition for a truly socialist revolution. This means that the creative destruction Marxists are indistinguishable in any pragmatic terms of what they actually do from the most ruthless capitalists. And in fact, in the course of the novel, their actions seem to totally coincide with those of a group of investors who have concluded that, these are more quotes, there's money to be made off the destruction of the world, and that in fact apocalyptic destruction constitutes an unprecedented business opportunity. They therefore seek to precipitate a worldwide nuclear conflagration, arguing that on behalf of our investors, we're obligated to take every step we can to ensure that we corner the apocalypse market before anyone else does. Now, of course, all this is a deliberate caricature. Constantinou is writing something which is more satire than prophecy. But as I've argued elsewhere, science fiction as a genre really is not prophecy. It doesn't claim to actually predict the future. Rather, I would say science fiction works to extrapolate elements of the present, to push actually existing conditions all the way to their most extreme consequences. That is to say, science fiction is not about the actual future. Rather, it's about futurity, if I can use that as an abstract noun. Science fiction grasps and brings to visibility what the philosopher Gilles Deleuze calls the virtual, or what Karl Marx sometimes called tendential processes. Tendential things, our tendencies, are not things that have to happen, but things that there's a movement towards their happening. Okay, science fiction picks out certain implicit trends that are embedded in our actual social and technological situation. So it's sort of like these are elements of futurity which exist in the present. They aren't really present because they're not really happening, but they're potentials in the present, and therefore they represent a kind of futurity, whether or not they actually turn out to happen in the future. These trends really exist as tendencies or as potentialities, but they have not yet been actualized, and they may never be actualized. As Marx himself points out, and as other philosophers talking about causality and necessity have said more recently, a tendency is always accompanied by counteracting factors which may inhibit or even reverse it. The philosophers Stephen Mumford and Lily Ron Angem, who've written recently one of the most interesting books recently about causality, point out, for instance, that it's common parlance to say that if you strike a match, that causes fire to exist. But if you do this on the moon when there's no oxygen, it wouldn't cause fire. So there's always possibility of counteracting factors to any process. So the argument is that what science fiction writes about are these potentialities, these virtualities, these tendencies, which actually exist as virtual or possible tendencies, but that doesn't mean that they will necessarily come to pass. In sum, the present moment contains elements of actual futurity, but the unfolding of these elements of futurity, I should say of real futurity. Deleuze says what he calls virtual is something which is real but not actual. So these elements of futurity are real, they're really part of our present situation, but they will not necessarily actually unfold as actual future conditions. That's a contingent and not a guaranteed outcome. Science fiction provides us with narratives in which these potentialities of futurity do indeed come to pass. And this way it can be either a hopeful or a utopian or dystopian sign, a hopeful event or a warning. But we might say in this way that science fiction is the accelerationist art par excellence, accelerationist in its very nature. So that's why science fiction seems to be an important part of what is meant by accelerationism. To speak in political, aesthetic, and philosophical terms, accelerationism may be defined as the argument, or at least as the claim, since it's not always argued so much as just stated, that the only way out is the way through. What does this mean for us today? We seem to be living today in a condition of long-term slow-motion catastrophe. Global warming and environmental pollution and degradation threaten to undermine our whole mode of life. And this mode of life is itself increasingly stressful and unviable due to the depredations of what I can only call neoliberal capitalism. Neoliberalism is one of these terms that's thrown around way too often and meaning too many things, and sometimes vaguely just anything that anybody doesn't like in contemporary life. But I think I can use it in a more limited and more rigorous sense. I mean, it is a specific mode of what Marx would call a specific mode of production, or maybe if capitalism is a mode of production, then neoliberal capitalism is a specific variety of that. Or what Michel Foucault called a form of governmentality, a way not just of this what the official government does, but of governing, of the way in society that actions are encouraged, inhibited, promoted, or whatever. Neoliberalism is a specific mode of production or form of governmentality that is characterized by 1, transfers of wealth from everybody else to the 1%, 2, by the privatization of what used to be common or public resources, and 3, by the subjection of all aspects of life to competition and the so-called discipline of the market. Under relentless environmental and financial assault, we live in what might well be called a state of crisis, except that crisis implies a sharp and immediate moment of reckoning, whereas this condition, our condition of crisis, has become for us a chronic and seemingly permanent one. The crisis never gets resolved. It doesn't have the culmination point or the immediacy of a crisis. It's just always there. Global warming and neoliberal governance are examples of what the environmentalist critic Timothy Morton calls hyper-objects. Phenomena, and this is a quote from Morton, that stretch our ideas of time and space and say far outlast most human timescales, or they're massively distributed in terrestrial space and so are unavailable to immediate experience. These hyper-objects affect everything that we do, but we cannot point to them in specific instances. Morton's best example of this is when he talks about climate change or global warming. We can directly experience the weather, but we cannot directly experience the climate. The chains of causality are far too complicated and intermeshed for me to prove that any one particular storm is the result of global warming. And in fact, global warming is still operative as an overall condition of possibility for our lives, even when the weather is okay and when it's not too hot or when, or whatever. In order to make sense of our condition, we're forced to deal with massive and difficult abstractions. We therefore need to develop some, and that's what the condition of hyperobjects, I think, is. We therefore need to develop something like what Frederick Jameson calls an aesthetic of cognitive mapping, something that allows us to grasp our positioning as individual and collective subjects and regain a capacity to act and struggle, that's his quote, within a space and time of unrepresentable complexity. So hyperobjects or these massive systems seem to be unrepresentable. We can't grasp them in experiential terms, and yet they seem to condition everything we do experience in one way or another. Okay. Now, accelerationism is the argument that the only way to deal with these terms is to push through them, that we can't really, because we can't step back from them. For accelerationists, we cannot escape these situations of climate catastrophe and neoliberal governance by hearkening back to a supposedly simpler and better time. We need to embrace and extend the complexities and abstractions of modernity if we are ever to do anything about them. That's basically what the accelerationist credo comes down to. We cannot put a stop to environmental catastrophe and economic exploitation by retreating into a small is beautiful localism, or by building a bridge to the 18th century, to quote the title of a book by the media critic Neil Postman. According to accelerationists, we cannot escape complexity by simplifying. We cannot secede from multinational capitalism because it is everywhere and nowhere. Just like the heavily polluted air that we breathe, everywhere, it's everywhere. We can't lay hold of it, but it's all around us. We can't step aside from it. And from an accelerationist point of view, this is the problem with certain other leftist tendencies, like, for instance, Italian autonomism, which sort of argues for a kind of withdrawal from the world market and withdrawal from capitalism. Or for that matter, I'd say the Occupy movement's notions of direct democracy. Again, I don't want to get into a big polemic about this, and I don't really feel it's my forte to talk about political organizing, but one of the issues perhaps with the Occupy movement I found incredibly inspiring, but one of the issues with it perhaps was that it couldn't go past a certain level, and this is partly because of the way in which it was so embedded with, the in themselves praiseworthy things like direct democracy. Everybody had to go to the meeting and make the decision. Nothing could be delegated, and so on and so forth. That creates difficulties of scale. So, I mean, I don't really want to make that polemic a major thing, though it's the kind of thing that an accelerationist point of view would probably harp on. But anyway, I'm just mentioning that in passing. Against all these suggestions, accelerationism follows Bertolt Brecht's advice. Don't start from the good old things, but the bad new ones. It's actually from an article by Walter Benjamin about Brecht. I don't know where if Brecht actually said this, or if he actually did, or if it was in conversation, but it comes from Benjamin, but it's attributed to Brecht, by Benjamin to Brecht. The accelerationist claim is that the only way to overcome neoliberal capitalism is to drain it to the dregs, to follow it into its furthest and strangest consequences, to push it to its most extreme point. Accelerationism argues that we must exacerbate the tensions, contradictions, and hidden tendencies of neoliberal capitalism, in the hope this will lead capitalism to explode, or that it will at least open up a way beyond it. In its most maximal expression, such an approach is dangerous and stupid and clearly ridiculous. It comes to resemble Constantinu's picture of the creative destruction school of Marxism-Leninism, which becomes indistinguishable from what it supposedly opposes. It also, of course, could be very irresponsible and just lead to misery and catastrophe for everyone. However, I want to suggest that in smaller and more modest doses, the ideas around accelerationism might in fact be viable and valuable. Consider, for instance, Frederick Jameson's somewhat scandalous proposal to uncover the hidden, what he calls the hidden utopian dimension of Walmart. Walmart has been for many good reasons, has been an object of attack on the left because it drives out other businesses, it exploits workers, and so on and so forth. However, Jameson points out that that Walmart's hyper-efficient global organization of product distribution, its efficiency, is something that a future communist society might well want to make use of. Walmart continually revolutionizes its technologies, which is something Marx said capitalism does in general. It makes use of the latest developments in computation and communications in order to boost productivity and therefore increase its products. But under different economic conditions, Jameson suggests, such technologies could just as well be used, and indeed something like them would have to be used in order to free people as much as possible from meaningless toil. In other words, it doesn't free Walmart's workers from meaningless toil, but this kind of technology probably could, and technologies that are probably necessary if we're ever going to free people from meaningless toil. Phenomena like Walmart need to be understood dialectically, Jameson tells us, rather than just being moralistically denounced. To put this point more generally, we might say that capitalism has created abundance, but at the same time it always needs to reimpose scarcity, and I'll come back to this theme. We live in an age of astonishing scientific discoveries and technological inventions. Computers can process information as never before. We're beginning to manipulate life itself on the genetic level. We should soon be able to utilize energy from the sun, freeing us from dependence upon the environmentally destructive and physically limited stock of fossil fuels. Thanks to advances in automation, there's probably less need for irksome labor today than at any time in human history since the invention of agriculture. All these developments should result in leisure and sustainable affluence for everyone, but instead they've led to grotesque inequalities of wealth and power, to ecological devastation on an unprecedented scale, not to mention a regime of what the philosopher Robin James calls superpanoptic surveillance. The minimal accelerationist argument is that we should take control of these technologies and repurpose them rather than rejecting them or destroying them. A slightly more pointed version of accelerationism would suggest that we can seize upon the contradiction between the massive potentials opened up by these technologies and the narrowly repressive ends for which they're actually being used. The word contradiction is a word which is very heavy in Marxist theory, and in fact a lot of this is understood in this way. Accelerationism really goes back to certain hints, at least, in classical Marxism. So I have a few quotes here. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels famously describe the liberating effects of capitalism, and this is a long quote from the Communist Manifesto. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast, frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. In place of the old wants, satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? Now, this is a passage which is hard not to regard with a certain amount of ambiguity, but I think the point of it is that Marx and Engels are not simply condemning capitalism. They don't sound particularly critical. If anything, they're a little too enthusiastic about man subjugating nature and things like that, which today we might want to be more suspicious of than anybody was in the 19th century. But it's not that Marx is celebrating capitalism either. I think, again, as Jameson says, and as we're saying with Jameson's, Marx is saying we have to understand capitalism dialectically rather than moralistically, rather than thumbs up or thumbs down. We have to see the intertwining of the different things that it does. And I mean, in the various things he mentions, I mean, on the one hand, I think we can say that among the injustices of modernization, capitalist modernization, have been destruction of old ways of life and of things which people clung to for good reason and of their values and traditions. But at the same time, a lot of this has led to various forms of liberation. People freed from the yokes of custom and tradition, freed from poverty, freed from things which they had to do. Marx insists that it's two-sided, that we can't just simply say yay or no, that we have to see it as a complicated process which has multiple aspects. So Marx does not condemn capitalism for being evil. He hates it for causing massive suffering and oppression, but he's not saying that where capitalism has melted everything into air, we need to get back to solid ground again. Rather, Marx is interested in the way that capitalism creates wealth and poverty simultaneously. Capitalism has produced the conditions and possibilities for a world of affluence and freedom at the same time that it has also produced misery, alienation, and oppression. Joseph Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction, referenced by Constantino because it's become so much of a watchword of neoliberal ideology. Everything, I mean, if you read something like Wired magazine or business magazines, they're always talking about creative destruction and rah, rah, rah. And it's too bad, some people have to, have their lives ruined because we're going to build these new technologies which will connect everything to the speed of thought. The right-wing Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter really got that phrase, or he invented the phrase, but he got the idea from Marx. And Schumpeter is really interesting to me as basically the only one of sort of pro-capitalist economists who really took Marx seriously and read him carefully, as opposed to just blanket, throw him in the trash bin. Anyway, Schumpeter was willing to say, well, it's too bad that workers are suffering because of some new development which puts them in horrible assembly lines, but their great-grandchildren will be much better off as a result, so they should just suck it up. Marx is unwilling to say something like that. He's unwilling to just wave away all the destruction which goes along with the creation. But and Marx is certainly compassionate towards the victims of history in a way that somebody like Schumpeter never was, and full of savage sarcasm towards the ruling class. But Marx's view is also relentlessly non-nostalgic. For him, there's no possibility of going back from capitalism's own convulsions to something before. There's no sense of Marx is the founder of accelerationism in the sense that he says there's no way of returning to an earlier state of things. But how does this lead to the idea of going through the contradictions again and beyond them? In several famous passages, Marx argues that capitalism tends toward a point where its very form, the property form, becomes an obstacle to the further development of the productive forces that it has unleashed. And here are a couple of quotes from the later Marx. In the preface, these are very famous quotes. In the preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, he writes the following. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or, this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins, he says, an era of social revolution. A similar passage in Volume 1 of Capital. The monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of production which has flourished alongside and under it. The centralization of the means of production and the socialization of labor reach a point at which they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated. Now, the kind of prophetic part of that is he's sort of saying rah-rah for how these situations are reversed. But I think the important part of those passages is the way in which he says that these things develop. You wouldn't have had this development without capitalism, but capitalism leads to a point where its own inventions create a tension with its institutions. And I think you can see something like this happening today if you look at questions of so-called intellectual property, especially on the internet. We have a situation where the digital technologies the last 20 or 30 years have led to, cheap, almost extremely cheap multiple copying of anything that's digitized, music, images, words. And at the same time, we have a very censorious regime of insists on copyright, insists on locking down all these things with things like digital rights management, and taking something which has actually become plentiful and abundant and easily transferable and easily multipliable and putting in fetters, not allowing you. I mean, and there can be a lot of arguments of a copyright. I mean, but I think a lot of people share my thing. It kind of really pisses me off when I buy a movie from Amazon, put it on my iPad, and then I try to stream it from the iPad to my television monitor, and it won't do it because the digital rights management has disabled the possibility of that function. I mean, there are just a lot of instances. I think this is a very concrete instance of the way in which the possibility, the potentialities which the technology has developed are contradicted by the property relations, which ironically were what first developed this technology, but which now are limiting its effect. And that's just one example, but I think, it gives a concrete sense of what Marx was talking about 150 years ago. Okay, I think that accelerationism originates in these passages and others like them from Marx's writings. And of course, these passages are very contradictory. They end triumphantly with this idea of the negation of the negation. The expropriators are expropriated. So it sometimes seems, and it seemed to many readers of Marx, that Marx is sort of talking about a passage of inevitability. This is what's parodied in Constantinu's science fiction novel when he talks about this sect which takes Marx's writings as literal predictions of the future. If this were the case, then all we'd have to do is sit back and wait for the contradictions to unfold, and magically we'd have full communism or something like that. And that's obviously kind of ridiculous. It's not going to happen that way, and hasn't, and won't. But the opposite of that is again a kind of problematic thing also. Many Marxists, realizing that this doesn't just automatically work, have instead, sort of adopted a kind of hyper-voluntarism. It must be the will of the organized proletariat will start the revolution, all this kind of stuff. I think you see this in Lenin and the Russian Revolution. You see it in Marxism, Leninism today. You see it in contemporary thinkers of the ultra-left like Slavoj Žižek and Alain Badiou, both of whom seem to embrace, say, oh, capitalism is horrible, but through sheer force of will, through this kind of hyper-voluntarism, we can overturn it and create something different and better. And that seems to me much more about wishful self-congratulatoriness than about anything which relates to what anybody can actually do in the world today. Now, this doesn't mean that I have another solution, that I know the way things could work out, but I'm just trying to point out these impasses and suggest that accelerationism comes up as a way of thinking around or thinking through these impasses. And in course of this, the question about material abundance, I think, is something which needs to be emphasized more. We're very concerned, we're very aware because of the environment and because of the crisis that we have limited resources, and often we have a discourse that we have to do is we have to, sort of people have to buy less, people have to do with less, everybody has to embrace scarcity. I'm not convinced that this is a very either accurate or a very smart way to talk about things. For one thing, I mean, again, the sun is an abundant source of energy which we don't know how to tap very well, but which, we're not really short of energy. We're short of things like fossil fuels, or we're going to become short of things like fossil fuels. And the sun itself is not what's destroying the environment, and tapping solar energy wouldn't. I don't want to, become like a crackpot who talks about how solar energy is going to solve the problems of everything. But it's worth pointing out that it's not just from a Marxist point of view that this contradiction has become apparent. John Maynard Keynes, the most important economist, I think, of the 20th century, and whose work led to the economic boom in the 1940s and 1950s and 60s, and the crisis we've had since the 70s basically results from or coincides with policymakers turning their backs on him and going back to older ideas about economics. Keynes wrote a very interesting article in 1930 called The Prospects for Our Grandchildren, and he said that it was very foreseeable that economic growth could solve the economic problem for the first time in the history of mankind, is how Keynes puts it. And he says, and I think this is relevant in this case. Now this is from Keynes's essay. Now it is true that the needs of human beings may seem to be insatiable, but they fall into two classes: those needs which are absolute in the sense that we feel them whatever the situation of our fellow human beings may be, and those which are relative in the sense that we feel them only if their satisfaction lifts us above, makes us feel superior to our fellows. Needs of the second class Those which satisfy the desire for superiority may indeed be insatiable, for the higher the general level, the higher still are they. But this is not so true of the absolute needs. A point may soon be reached, much sooner perhaps than we are all of us aware of, when these needs are satisfied in the sense that we prefer to devote our further energies to non-economic purposes. So here we have Keynes imagining a future for humankind within 100 years, writing 1930, when the economic problem of humankind will be solved, and Keynes therefore foresaw a state of society in which, for the first time in human history, we would have the wherewithal for all people to lead lives of leisure and self-cultivation. Now, this obviously is not the present economic and social condition under which we live, even though, if anything, the productive forces have been promoted far even more extensively than Keynes himself foresaw. So I think this is something that's worth taking seriously, even from a non-Marxist perspective, and I think it has to do with, again, some of the ideas that accelerationism is striving towards. So we have a sense that we have a system which has been very productive in terms of material goods, which has backed us into a dead end. We don't quite know how to get out of it. We seem oppressed by it. All the solutions seem to point back to more of the same. In terms of neoliberalism specifically, all the intellectual justifications of neoliberalism have been destroyed by the events of 2008 and afterwards. And yet the response of governments all over the world has been to just be even more neoliberal as a solution for the fact that neoliberalism has been shown not to work. So you just do more of it. You know, maybe if you do more of it, we'll postpone it a little more. I think a lot of the mode we have today is we have incipient catastrophe, and we're always postponing that catastrophe, and policy consists in ways, how can we push it a few further years down the road while we flounder out a little bit more? Okay, so I think this is the background into which accelerationism has become a term in recent years. But there's a more specific periodicity to this, and I think it comes really from the 1960s and 70s. And there's several aspects to this. There's a very interesting book by Luc Boltanski and Yves Chiapello, two French economists, two French sociologists, about the new culture of capitalism. And what they say is that all the things which were desired by the political opposition movements and the counterculture of the 1960s have in fact been granted us by neoliberal capitalism. And they see this as a kind of lure and deception. But, you know, people were tired of boring jobs on an assembly line, so instead they get workers work in teams in factories and get responsibility for their products, which actually makes their lives more nerve-wracking than it was before. Or people don't like being locked into the same career for the whole life. You start something at 20, and you know, until you retire, the day you retire, you're doing the same job over and over again. So now we have precarious labor, where no jobs, aside from tenure in academia, no jobs are sure. You're almost certain to be fired in 3 or 4 years, and you'll just have to, you know, start from scratch all over again, over and over and over again. So there's a kind of ironic way in which what people were demanding in terms of quality of life has been given to us. It's like the fairy tale where somebody gets a wish fulfilled in ways which are oppressive. That's sort of their analysis of what's happened in the last 30 or 40 years. But the 60s and 70s is also the time when the more narrow sense, what I'm now calling accelerationism, really comes to pass. And I should say, so to give a more specific genealogy, the actual term is only developed, first appears in 2010, excuse me, like 3 years ago, by Benjamin Noyes, a British critic, in his book, The Persistence of the Negative, which I have a blurb on the back of, but I'm not praising it just for that. I wrote the blurb because I think it's a great book, even though I disagree with a lot of it. But anyway, Noyes invents the term accelerationism to designate a certain philosophical current that for him has its roots in French philosophy of the 1960s and 1970s, philosophy of people such as Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari and Jean Baudrillard and Jean-Francois Lyotard, and which then gets transferred and taken up by many segments of the left intelligentsia, including Italian autonomists like Tony Negri, and to some extent people like Alain Badiou and Slavoj Žižek, and to some extent non-Marxists like Bruno Latour as well, who he has a chapter about in his book also. They all seem to pick up, he says, on this kind of sense of accelerationism. Accelerationism, he says, has its roots in 1968. In 1968, there was this big left-wing uprising in France, which ultimately failed. And the result of this 68 uprising was basically to drive the French intelligentsia crazy. Some of them went to the extreme left, and some of them went to the extreme right, and some of them went both to the extreme left and then to the extreme right. You have people who, in the wake of 68, became Maoists and called for, you know, violent terrorism to destroy bourgeois society, and then 5 years later are writing articles about how we must be content with liberal democracy because communism always leads to terror, and you know, there's a charming paradox that, you know, in the span of 5 years somebody can go from one of those positions to another. But leaving that aside and being less snarky and talking about, say, some of the more reputable figures from that period. The 1968 uprising was an important reference for Deleuze and Guattari, and it remains today an important reference point for the French philosopher Alain Badiou. But in the wake of 68, they developed a kind of philosophy about this, which is sort of where accelerationism gets its first specific formulation, though again, they didn't have the word. And this is a quote from Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, which Noyes points to, which Mark Fisher and others who have written about acceleration point to. So I'll just read the short quote from Anti-Oedipus. But which is the revolutionary path? Is there one? To withdraw from the world market, as Samir Amin advises third world countries to do in a curious revival of the fascist economic solution? Or might it be to go in the opposite direction, to go further still, that is, in the movement of the market, of decoding and deterritorialization? For perhaps the flows are not yet deterritorialized enough, not decoded enough from the viewpoint of a theory and practice of a highly schizophrenic character. Not to withdraw from the process, but to go further, to accelerate the process, as Nietzsche put it. In this matter, the truth is that we haven't seen anything yet. Okay, this passage has been much cited and much repeated by others. It has a certain particular reference point, as well as a more general reference point in Deleuze and Guattari's thoughts, so I'd like to say a little about that. The specific reference point is a critique of Samir Amin, who is a third world Marxist economist. Amin advised third world countries to totally withdraw from the world capitalist market. It's the only way to build socialism, otherwise you'll be contaminated by capitalism and you'll be stuck and you'll be caught. Deleuze and Guattari wrote this criticism in 1972. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia and apparently adopted Amin's advice. It's been disputed. It's been much claimed. I don't know how true it is, but it's certainly been claimed by many people that Pol Pot and the other heads of the Khmer Rouge were devoted students of Samir Amin, and their reign of terror partly came from, you know, following his prescription. So, I mean, I'm a little wary of blaming philosophers and economists for actual policy decisions, but there is something disturbing there, and it makes, in retrospect, it would make what Deleuze and Guattari said a few years earlier seem like maybe a more palatable alternative. Though, of course, one would have to mention that in the 80s and 90s, and to this day, governments in the global South, mostly pushed by the World Bank and the World Trade Organization and other such organizations, did what Deleuze and Guattari recommend. They embraced the world market, let the flows go as far as possible, and they got screwed as a result of that also. So I don't know what the verdict of history is on that kind of situation. But be that as it may, I think Deleuze and Guattari, as the quote indicated, their deterritorialization and reterritorialization are key terms in Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy. Deterritorialization sort of implies, well, as the word suggests, being uprooted from a territory. It's sort of that you have, it's sort of the opposite of think of a kind of return to the past, of a kind of saying that, I mean, basically to be uprooted from a territory means to move elsewhere, to be transformed, to be translated, to be put in new forms, to let things flow, not let things be stuck. And what Deleuze and Guattari say, and this is their paraphrase of what Marx said in the passage I quoted earlier, capitalism is a massive engine of deterritorialization. It destroys traditions, it uproots all kinds of things. It makes things flow. We have these exchange of commodities which go around the world. It does all now it has enormous flows of information at the same time, but capitalism but this deterritorialization, if it went far enough, it would dissolve capitalism altogether, turn it into something else. And so capitalism reterritorializes what it deterritorializes. It for all kinds of things such as nationalisms, laws of private property, identity politics, all these kinds of things for Deleuze and Guattari are ways of reterritorializing and preventing the flows from getting too crazy and out of the control of capitalism. So capitalism deterritorializes, but if it just did that, then it ultimately would dissolve itself. What it has to do is reterritorialize, restabilize, move things back, create value, not only create massive productive value, but also root the value, make sure it's owned, make sure it's in private hands, and so on and so forth. And so again, it's their version of Marx's dialectical process, though they hated the word dialectical, but it's a similar kind of thing. what I'm giving is a fairly optimistic interpretation, but the accelerationism passes from Deleuze and Guattari to a British philosopher in the 1990s named Nick Land. There's a volume of his writings now. Nick Land taught at the University of Warwick in philosophy department in the UK in the 1990s, and he was there for about 5 years, and then he basically disappeared. I mean, the last I heard of him, he's living in Shanghai, writing articles for an English language business newspaper in Shanghai, and also penning, ultra right wing crypto-fascist manifestos on his blog in his spare time. But I know a number of people who studied under Land, and they said he was a very inspiring force before he maybe went over the deep end, except going over the deep end was almost what his philosophy was about. Well, Land reinterpreted Deleuze and Guattari, and Deleuze and Guattari are ambivalent. They praised deterritorialization, unfixing, flowing as important, but they also say too much of it and you'll just be committing suicide, falling into a black hole, just losing everything. So they advocate a kind of strategic holding back. They sort of think it has to be nuanced in one way or another, or between two extremes. Capitalism may re-territorialize too much, stabilize things too much, block its own flows of liberated desire, but you can't just have flows of liberated desire if they just go into the infinity, into the void. Then we're lost. Land sort of embraces the kind of nihilistic possible conclusions of this. For him, liberation is complete deterritorialization, everything becoming, all identities being shattered and destroyed, all immobility all fixity being uprooted, everything flowing, which ultimately, for Land, leads into a kind of total disintegration and death, and Land sort of celebrates this as a kind of ecstatic movement into the void. He also talks about capital, and he also extrapolates from Deleuze and Guattari's analysis of capitalism, and indeed from Marx's analysis of capitalism, to a way where he celebrates capital because capital is this alien force. It's an alien force in the future which is destroying humanity and tyrannizing everything and turning everything into more of itself. Now, Marx famously said that capitalism is like a vampire, destroying life to create more of its own property, destroying living labor to create more dead labor. Land says, flips that around and says, this is, we should welcome this. We should welcome the destruction of humanity at the hands of this inhuman, alien, outer space science fictional force of capital, which is relentlessly destroying everything in its wake. Obviously, this is not a sustainable position to actually live through, and as opposed to rhetorically advocate, and this may have something to do with why Land wasn't able to sustain his position, eventually left academia and fled from academic and intellectual circles. But I don't really necessarily, I don't find Land that interesting, but I know a lot of people I do find interesting, whose views I respect, study under, and value his contact with them very highly. So I feel I have to try to take him seriously, even though I find it hard to. So Land kind of represents the side of accelerationism, which seems to be totally crazy and wild, and to lead to horror or nothingness, or even worse, to the celebration of horror and nothingness. But we'll try to wind things up by giving a sense. But again, I'm suggesting that accelerationism has more limited as well as more extreme forms. And its more limited form, it takes off from certain things that Marx works out. And if you find Marx at all convincing, then you probably have to at least think through the possibility of taking this seriously. I'm not trying to make the argument. I'm obviously drawing heavily on Marxism here, but I'm not trying to make the argument of proving Marx is right or something like that. But anyway, if you take this kind of view of things, then I think you have to take seriously Marx's sense that the processes of capitalism don't just reinforce it; they somehow lead beyond it. So, I mean, the most nihilistic view of this would be kind of Land's celebration of dissolution and death. A less nihilistic but still very problematic version of it would involve a sense that, we'll have a revolution if things get bad enough, which seems to me to be also kind of stupid and disproved by when it's been tried. But I was talking about Nixon and Ford. In 1968, when Nixon was elected president against Hubert Humphrey, and George Wallace, the Southern segregationist, ran as a third-party candidate, I believe the Harvard Crimson, the Harvard student newspaper, advocated voting for Wallace on the grounds that if Wallace became president, things would become horrible, there would have to be a socialist revolution, and everything would become better. Now that's, I mean, it's too kind to say that's silly. I mean, it's really, disastrously stupid. And accelerationism in some forms does seem to me to come out to things like that. But I don't want to dismiss it because I think in certain respects, in other respects, it may be taken in more moderate. It's like a drug. If you take too much of it, you kill yourself or make yourself sick, but in moderate doses, it may do some good. I think that accelerationism really does point to the way in which capitalism can't be just moralistically condemned, and the way in which we have to some degree, press through with modernity rather than turning our backs on it. We don't really have the choice, but if we don't think about it, then we won't realize the possibility of maybe doing good things with what's been produced and what the situation we have now, instead of only having its dystopian effects. So for me, this is linked, therefore, ultimately to something, I mean, to shift ground from politics to aesthetics, which is my real interest. I've been talking about the sense in which we have this sense of an impasse under our present conditions, and accelerationism is an attempt to think us or to push us past that impasse. But it's not just an impasse of political action, it's also really, I think, an impasse of imagination. There's a sense in which the contemporary version of financial or neoliberal capitalism has robbed us of the future, and this was not true of the earlier capitalism of 100 or 75 years ago. But I mean this in several ways. One is that if you look at all the stuff about derivatives and other arcane financial instruments, which are so responsible for the crash of 2008, which we're still suffering from today, I mean, what these derivatives do is they're really attempts to kind of colonize and control the future. Nietzsche wrote 125 years ago, I love the uncertainty, the unknowability of the future. But modern finance doesn't want to think that there's anything unknowable and anything uncontrollable. The whole philosophy behind derivatives is about taking the future, taking potentialities of the future and quantifying them, turning them to degrees of risk, which can be quantified and measured, and therefore which can be paid for. It's sort of flattening out the possibility of the future, trying to... the big question about temporality, which has haunted philosophy for 200 years, is a question of futurity and newness. So Bergson and talked about creative evolution. Whitehead talked about creativity. Deleuze talked about the new. What they're all emphasizing is the idea that the future is not entirely determined by the present and the past. There's always at least a possibility that things won't just continue in the same route, that something new might happen. Future temporality is the possibility of some things changing. It doesn't guarantee that the change will be for the good, but it at least says that change is possible, that it can happen. In a certain sense, you might say the current phase of finance is to try to get rid of that by quantifying this all as risk. I mean, this is also related, I think, in the development of economics, where you move from Keynes. Keynes's whole point was that you couldn't do things like this because the future generally was unknowable. You could not turn radical uncertainty into risk. The entire financial system we live in today is based precisely on turning radical uncertainty into risk. Now, of course, Keynes and Nietzsche and Marx are right. You can't really do that. Hence, things fall apart. Hence, you have horrible crashes like what happened in 2008. But nonetheless, our whole financial system seems to be based on, again, capturing futurity, suppressing the possibility that the future will be anything new and radically different, making sure that the future is only a continuation of the past. And this also has to do with, I think, the banalization of ideas about creativity and novelty in current culture. We have business schools and businesses value nothing more than creativity and novelty. And yet creativity and novelty, which is always supposed to be world-shaking, always seems to me, getting this iPad 4 is now obsolete because Apple has now released the iPad Air, which is both lighter and more powerful. And every time Apple has one of these announcements, they say that, this is a revolutionary thing. I mean, obviously I use these products, I find them very valuable, I really like them, but there's something very despairing to me about the way in which novelty and creativity always turn out to be these incremental changes, which are really more of the same thing and the continuation of the same culture and the same sense of advertising and branding and all this kind of stuff. Okay, I think what that's linked to more generally is a sense that we can't imagine a future anymore. And this is something that's been written about, I think, most powerfully by Mark Fisher in his book, Capitalist Realism, which came out 5 or 6 years ago, and which to my mind is maybe the most important book of cultural theory or cultural criticism of the current, since 2000. Fisher's book, what Fisher calls capitalist realism, is the idea that we can't imagine an alternative to the present. Or Fisher, quoting both Slavoj Žižek and Frederick Jameson, who have said this in different ways, but Fisher sort of takes what they said and systematizes it. The idea is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Think about the way in which apocalyptic imaginings are so prevalent in our culture, lots of movies and video games and things like that. It's easier to imagine everything crashing down, everything being destroyed, than it is to imagine, say, a system which would not be capitalist, but would not also be totalitarian, would be somewhat more humane, and things would be arranged in a more pleasant manner, and people would have more leisure and more time for self-cultivation. I mean, that seems to be unimaginable in any form other than, buying as many, getting rich or get rich or die trying, buy as many consumer goods as you can. So I mean, it's sort of like we can't imagine anything except we only imagine apocalyptic destruction because it's the kind of only alternative we see to imagining that this system goes on forever and ever and ever and never changes. This was codified by the real sort of political accelerationists, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping, all of whom instituted the neoliberal policies which we're talking about now. Thatcher said, there is no, and with one of her slogans, there is no alternative. You might not like capitalism, it's very harsh, it forces you to make difficult choices, it forces you to make sacrifices, but there's no alternative. There's no other possible, thinkable, imaginable arrangement of humankind that could at all work. And in a certain sense, that's the way our imaginations are constrained by that. And so I think I value accelerationism aesthetically, even if it doesn't make sense to me politically, because it's a way of trying to work out or work past this kind of deadlock of the imagination. Accelerationist science fiction, and to go back since I started with science fiction being about futurity, picks out elements of futurity which actually exist now, even though we're often not aware of them, even though they haven't been actualized. Now, this can be either dystopian or utopian. Some of these elements are ones which are extremely destructive and debilitating, and I certainly get, like many people, I get a lot of pleasure from dystopian literature. And I'm saying we imagine apocalypse because it's the only way we can imagine the end of capitalism in a way, but in a certain sense, part of the pleasure we get, the unacknowledged pleasure we get from apocalyptic narratives of the end of everything, is that it's sort of like I won't have to pay back my credit card debt because the world's destroyed. I'm deliberately saying in a facetious way, but I think it's really true that this is part of the imaginative force of such things. But also, I think many kind of even dystopian science fiction narratives that they're most interesting actually work through the dilemmas I'm talking about. Even as they show us a despairing future, a future in which the most feral and destructive aspects of current day capitalism become much more powerful and virulent and control everything, they also imagine a way out of it. So I don't know, I don't want to take too much more time. What I was going to do is segue into this is to talk about some science fiction narratives. Maybe I'll just mention them briefly and urge you to read them on your own. I mean, there are a lot of things. I had two science fiction short stories particularly in mind. One is both by contemporary American science fiction writers. One is by Paolo Bacigalupi, and it's from his volume of short stories called Pump 6. And the story, you actually can find it for free online if you search. It's called The People of Sand and Slag. And it imagines a future in which the environment has been so horribly devastated and so poisoned that the only way human beings can survive is that we've gotten both mechanical implants and genetic alteration to ourselves so that we can survive, in an atmosphere of pollutants and poisonous gases and things like that. And it's about this group of people who are working in this horrible wasteland, which is all that's left of the earth after years of environmental depredation, and it sort of tries to inhabit it's narrated by one member of the group. It tries to inhabit their mentality. And what happens is they encounter a dog. And this is something they don't understand because dogs have presumably been extinct for 50 years. Nobody's ever seen one. They can't account for the fact, or this thing, which they eventually work out must be a dog. They've never seen a dog before, must exist. And the stories, I won't give away the conclusion, but the story is about the ways in which they deal with the cognitive dissonance of something like a dog still existing compared to the normality, what we see as devastation and hopelessness, but which for them is a normality and their everyday situation. The other short story is by another American science fiction writer, Paul Di Filippo. It came out in a volume of his called Babylon Babies, and the story is called Phylogenesis. And again, I'm not sure this one's available for free online, though you can get electronic copies of the volume it's in. But anyway, Phylogenesis imagines a future in which an enormous race of enormous, like, alien beings, like, like these things which float through outer space, which is like 10 miles wide or something like that, come and devastate the Earth. And apparently these aliens float through outer space. They come to a star system. They get nourishment or replenishment by devastating and destroying everything on a planet which they encounter. And then they go back out in outer space and reproduce and spread through the galaxy. So these aliens come, a group of these aliens come to Earth. They destroy everything in Earth. They almost wipe out, exterminate the human race. Human beings manage to hang on just barely by genetically engineering ourselves to become parasites which exist in the bodies of these enormous beings. So Earth has been totally devastated. No life can exist on Earth anymore. But human beings somehow survive as parasites. I mean, I think the story says they reduce in height to maybe adults are 2 feet tall. People grow up faster, have a longer gestation, have a much shorter gestation period, all those kinds of things. And it's a beautiful story. The story it starts by saying that life is inventive, life is tenacious, life is resilient. Even when it seems to no hope, life nonetheless finds a way to flourish. And then it describes in great detail, or imagines in great detail, these future humans existing as parasites in the body of these monstrous superorganisms. And it's very interesting, the characteristics of the beings seem to me, though I don't know whether this was the intention of the author, to very much reproduce the kind of Homo economicus which has been developed under conditions of contemporary neoliberal capitalism. And so it's a story of, is it a story of horror or is it a story of survival? It's a kind of taking things which the author may see and which we may see as deformations of the possibilities of life and turning them into a kind of triumphant, we're surviving in spite of everything. And there's no replenishment of the Earth, but apparently human beings are able to somehow subsist, at least in small numbers, as these kinds of parasites in this much larger organism. So, I mean, those two stories to me are examples of accelerationist fiction, which actually takes the worst, which we may be facing, and tries to think something affirmative from it. And I'll just stop there.
Questions? Yeah, if you don't mind.
Hi. As you were talking, well, at one point you mentioned, can you hear me? Yeah. You mentioned, I think it was derivatives, right?
Yeah.
And futures, financial futures,
Yeah.
as means with which to colonize the future.
Yeah.
And as you were talking, I've been simultaneously aware of the traffic out there.
Mm-hmm.
And that got me thinking about futurism and the futurist romance with a car as an emblem of the future, of the fascist future that they thought we should hurtle towards. And some of your description of accelerationism, which I'd never heard of before until I saw the notice for the talk, by the way, kind of reminded me of the ethics and the aesthetics of futurism. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure. I think what you're saying is correct, but it has to be put in a kind of wider frame. Again, because the thing has different, I think, can have different political connotations, because Italian futurism was largely fascistic, but Russian constructivism in the 1920s and Russian shares a lot of features in terms of interest in machines and productivity and things like that, but gives it a very distinct, different edge. I mean, a film like Dziga Vertov's Man with the Movie Camera is a celebration of it's a socialist film which is celebrating the humane possibilities in production and in speed and in new technologies. So I think for the entire 20th century, this has been very ambiguous in the political things associated with it. Okay, what accelerationism I think tends to do or tries to do is to hopefully not do it. I mean, some of Nick Land's formulations seem to tend in ways which do, I think relate to Italian fascist futurism. But some of the other uses people made of it, I think, might go in more interesting political directions. I didn't talk about the Accelerationist Manifesto, which was published online several months ago by Alex Williams and Nick Cernacek, and they explicitly present accelerationism as a strategy for the left. But the way they put it, I mean, it's one part sort of, yeah, we should restart the space program and go into outer space and expand to other planets, and part that, you know, we shouldn't accept the rhetoric that, you know, planning or social planning or state planning is horrible and evil. We should realize that with new computing methods, we would probably plan much better than, say, the Soviets could do 50 years ago, and we should think about, you know, collectively taking grasp of our future. It's more voluntaristic than what I would advocate, but I think it's an interesting deployment that, and it uses some of those tropes, but in an explicitly egalitarian left-wing kind of way. So I think I don't think you can exclude what you're talking about, but I think it's always multiply determined. I mean, I wouldn't want to say that this is simple technological determinism either. So others.
Hello. So you mentioned hypervoluntarism as an impossibility, and I think it was hypervoluntarism.
Voluntarism.
Yeah, I'm sorry, excuse me. And how it was an impossibility.
Yeah.
And how we almost need this idea of an apocalypse or pushing capitalism over a cliff to have this kind of sense of new direction, to give us a chance to have a rebirth, just like the science fiction novel.
Yeah.
Even when everything was desolate, there was still a dog left. There was still that hope. So I guess my question is, isn't this really a chance for humanity to see what we're capable of, not in a technological sense of pushing ourselves over a cliff, and maybe getting to have all this new technology and be capable of new things, but it would be because of our destruction of what we had previously. So couldn't this really be a chance for humanity to see what we're capable of on an intellectual sense of using this technology, such as the internet? We have this way to communicate on a vast level, an idea, and couldn't the idea be to maybe use some kind of cognitive mapping to bring all of these changes into aspect on an environmental level and bring that idea into everyone's head? This is what's going on and there needs to be change now.
Yeah.
I mean, why do we need the destruction, I guess, is the question.
Well, yeah, sure. No, I'm very sympathetic with what you're saying. I think there are different nuances here, which I was trying to pry apart, but which in reality don't pry apart as easily as one would like. And one of the nuances is between, I mean, there's a certain sentiment, and this is something I don't like, but there's a certain sentiment in certain aspects, certain people who've been talking about accelerationism to sort of think, well, you know, we just have to make everything so bad that, you know, something will have to change because people won't be able to stand it. And that does not, that scares me. It doesn't appeal to me at all. There's another claim that, following Marx's analysis, that, again, things are double-edged. When you mentioned Frederick Jameson running Walmart, there are many ways in which Walmart is a horribly exploitative organization, but and we've certainly seen a lot of things which they've been doing to their workers recently, you know, which have come out recently. But at the same time, I think we should take seriously Jameson's suggestion that there's something positive in the way in which they've, you know, created global supply chains with incredible efficiency so that people can really get what they want right away. I mean, it's this whole thing, you know, it's an argument which comes up about consumerism. One argument, there's a very weird, remarkable book, I mean, which I mostly disagree with and violently dislike, but I think it's wonderful because it's so weird. It's a book called The Substance of Style by Virginia Pastrell. Virginia Pastrell is a libertarian, free market, capitalist economist. And she says, well, you know, in the mid-20th century, you just had this assembly line and everything was the same, and it was sort of like, you know, Henry Ford said you could have any color of Model T you want as long as it's black and that kind of thing. It says now, you know, we've reached such a wonderful point in capitalism that, you know, they make things of every possible style. So no matter what your aesthetic preference, you can always find exactly the thing you need. And she rhapsodizes about things like toilet cleaning brushes. And she says, have you ever looked at a catalog and see all the different styles and varieties of toilet cleaning brushes? No matter what your aesthetic preferences, you can find a toilet brush which exactly, matches what you really, truly inside yourself desire. And she's very big on this example because she says, a lot of people say that the only reason for product choice is because of what Veblen talked about, conspicuous consumption. I'm showing my car is more expensive than my neighbor's car. But since nobody displays their toilet brushes, this is pure aesthetic jouissance, didn't use that word, pure aesthetic, internal aesthetic bliss rather than something to keeping up with the Joneses or showing that you're better. And so this is sort of the wonder. Now, the way I'm talking about it, I think it's way too easy to make fun of it, and to a certain extent it should be made fun of, but it contains a kernel of, something which I think is true.
It should be made fun of because that's what drives capitalism. That's what drives our problem.
I think what that comes back to, which this author would not accept, of course, is the idea that precisely, Marxists often say think dialectically. I'm not sure I like the word because other people like Deleuze and Guattari hate the word and phrase dialectics, but are really doing the same thing. See that it's multivalent, and that it's doing good things and bad things, to put it crassly, at the same time. And that's sort of behind Marx's whole analysis. That, sometimes it's taken to mean that, yes, it's sometimes taken to mean that, well, it's good to have colonialism and imperialism in Africa because that's the only way that we can get to capitalism. We have to get through capitalism before we can get to socialism or something like that. And I can't say Marx is completely not guilty of having that mode of thought. But at the same time, that's not necessarily what it means. When you're talking about the internet, again, especially like in the 1990s when the internet was first emerging, there were these discourses which still continue today. One was, wildly utopian, the other was wildly dystopian. So, in recent years we have books saying that the internet is the most democratic thing ever invented because it allows everybody to communicate with everybody else. We've also had books saying that it's destroying people's attention span, it's idiotizing and infantilizing everybody, and it's an insidious tool which is destroying any hope of civilized existence. Now, I find it symptomatically interesting that both of these extremes are maintained. Obviously, I think that the truth lies in between somewhere, but it's too easy to just wimpily say be a moderate, both extremes are wrong. But I think it's indicative that the same technology arouses both such incredible euphoria and such incredible dread at the same time.
I think that is the problem, though, is that we're caught in this presentism.
Yeah.
We're moving so quickly, and we see that there's two sides to the coin, but we can't step back and take the time to evaluate which one is really better, which side. And I think that there is that side that might be better.
Well, again, there might be one way in which you want to move. I think what accelerationism is really saying, in the most broad sense, is that certain things don't work. It's a kind of an anti-nostalgic philosophy. It says, getting rid of Walmart and going back to the corner store won't be a solution to problems. Right. And just saying, oh, Walmart's great because we can buy so much stuff isn't a solution to problems, especially since one way to think of the economic change is that Henry Ford decided to pay his workers more so they could actually buy the cars they made. Walmart pays its workers so little that they can't shop anywhere else besides Walmart because that's the only place cheap enough for them to buy things on their very limited salaries. So obviously neither of those is, that's not a good solution. But
right,
as I said, going back
to the past,
accelerationism in the most general sense is saying going back to the corner store and getting rid of all the Walmarts won't in itself solve anything. And maybe there's a way we can use Walmart's technologies in other ways.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, I thought I saw another hand. Is that? Yes.
I don't know what to ask, actually. But I really want to ask something. As I like your work a lot, so
thank you.
What should the intellectuals do? I was wondering, if we put accelerationism aside, what's your position? Where's the ray of hope? Is it in between the East and West, or I guess what's your futurology? Where's your work leading to? Deleuze says intellectuals on the left should, I guess, firmly critique a possible future, something like that. So what's that picture you would draw for us? You know, it's a big question. I know. So,
it's one I don't have any good answers for. I mean, I think. I mean, I'd say ultimately I'm an aesthete. You know, I really, you know, I'm interested in sensations and thoughts which are creative and enjoyable in themselves without any further end. And that's often a no-no on people on the left, but I don't think, you know, everybody can be an activist all the time. I don't think I'm a very good activist. I used to participate in lots of demonstrations. I never organized anything and I probably couldn't. I mean, you know, I mean, I think I don't want to see it in the moralistic terms that if you believe this and therefore you must devote your whole life to fighting capitalism and, you know, nothing else is permissible because it's a failure to come up to your responsibilities. I mean, I'm just sort of interested in, I mean, I'm interested in exploring things which move me greatly or which I'm passionate about. And I don't think it's, I mean, you know, I mostly, in my work on film, I mostly write about contemporary films. And I'm interested in the ways in which digital technologies and the kind of attitudes which are expressed in certain contemporary American films are changing. It represents or reflects or participates in or helps to prove a kind of change of general sensibility in our culture. And I'm looking at the sensibility through the films, but I'm also looking at the films as aesthetic objects in their own right, which are inventing sort of new modes of sensation or sensibility. I also teach, you know, but everything's historically, you know, situated. I teach in my teaching. I teach lots of older films. I'm teaching a class now on classic Hollywood from 1930 to 1960. And the point is, you always have to, anything you look at, there are films I love, but which nonetheless have horrible and despicable things in them, like, you know, racist interludes or things like that. I mean, the only way to understand any artifact or anything aesthetic is to see that nothing's infinite. It reflects a certain situatedness. It's doing certain things with the situatedness. I think inventive works of art actually create new possibilities and new thresholds of experience, but it doesn't mean that they're activist works or that they actually affect, you know, political change in some sense, you know. So I try to have a reserved attitude about that. I mean, I think my political sensibility is part of everything I'm thinking about, but I don't see myself as basically a political thinker, really. Thank you. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. And that's sort of, I mean, that's one version of the opposition I was trying to sketch out. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's whose dialectic. That's really a problem of the.
I haven't finished here.
Oh, sorry.
If you don't mind.
I'm sorry.
I mean, this is a question which has been actually raised by a whole host of, let's put it this way, a whole host of, within quote, third world Marxists from Puerto Rico to Palestine to the Philippines. And I can think of some South Asian Marxists, for instance, Badruddin Omar and Farhad Musar, who actually raised this question, whose dialectics is in any way and called attention to Marx's own contention that it was fashionable, for instance, during Marx's time to invoke this dialectics, to talk about dialectics. In fact, something that Marx himself made very explicit in the postface to the second edition of the first volume of Capital, that he makes a distinction between this dialectics where you have yes and no, both. It is much more than that. It is not just, well, capitalism is great in certain areas and capitalism is bad at others. So, and yes and no and synthesize is much more than that. He speaks, in fact, of revolutionary dialectics, the kind of dialectics that would enable to bring about this total, radical transformation of whatever exists. And there, this question of this total rupture with the system becomes actually very relevant to revolutionary politics.
Yeah.
Something that I think we need to also rethink in the context of North American and European, intellectual debates.
Yeah. Okay, well, I don't have any good answers to the points you raised, which are really important ones. I mean, I'm taking it from certain people. Jameson is the one who says this is dialectical instead of being moralistic. He's being dialectical or warm-eyed instead of moralist. I'm wary of the term because of its because of the philosophical genealogy. So Marx declares himself a student of Hegel, says that he's putting Hegel on his feet, whereas Hegel, so by making the dialectic materialist, but after Marx, both in Engels' work and other later people, it becomes all kinds of different things. Part of what you get in a reaction to this is French thinkers, like especially Deleuze, express a hatred for the dialectic or for dialectics. It's the dirty word for them. It represents everything they hate about institutional state philosophy or whatever. Yet again, it depends on what kind of perspective. You can follow it in great detail. Deleuze's war against Hegel, which is really a war against French Hegelianism, not necessarily has that much to do with Hegel himself or with other readings of Hegel. You can ask what this has to do with Marxism, but you can also say that, in effect, many of the things Deleuze criticizes are the same things which the Hegelians as well as the Marxists criticize. The idea of reification, the idea of not understanding how things flow and transform and are interrelated in complex ways with other things. So I'm not entirely comfortable with the language because I think I'm talking about the kinds of things that I don't think I'm trying to avoid using it too prescriptively and to try to talk about things. I've had a reflex against ever using dialectics because of my background in studying Deleuze. Yeah. But I think a broader understanding sees that there's certain aspects of Hegel that Deleuze can't stand. I mean, arguably Marx does away with anyway, and other words like totality and things like that are problematic ones also. So I have an embarrassment of vocabulary, but I'm trying to be as agnostic as possible on the very specific disputes of different meanings of it that you were referring to. I'm trying to make it make it more general and less, and the risk of being a little more fuzzy. It's the best I can say about that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can take up some of the issues with you later because others ask questions.
Well, thank you for that.
But thanks.
Whole comment.
All right, time for one more.
Yeah, I guess I'm just struggling with maybe my own lack of imagination. It's hard for me to see what kind of form there is in between like the impossible voluntarism and then just like embracing like the Nicolan destruction or some kind of like hellish futurist future. And so where I don't quite see how it becomes actualized, how the good things that you're talking about with the efficiency of a Walmart or something like that, how those good things get embraced in actuality while doing away with the environmental destruction and all the other problems with neoliberal capital. And so how, without going to hell, how does change actually happen?
That's a wonderful question, which I haven't the faintest idea of how to answer. I mean, how we're
what's the accelerationist answer to that? I mean, it seems like Nick Land says, well, we have to go to hell. We do go to hell, and then change grows out of that. But it seems like you want to say, no, we don't quite have to go all the way to hell.
Well, I mean, I hope we don't. I mean, again, that was part of the reason I quoted Keynes's article from 1930, which is a very interesting article where he imagines that development of production, which he credits capitalism with, will lead to this kind of general, Keynes was a member of the Bloomsbury group with people like Virginia Woolf, and he was very into this kind of aesthetic of self-cultivation, which they all were. I mean, you could go back earlier to Oscar Wilde's essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, which Oscar Wilde says the reason he's a socialist is because only when people are freed from material concerns about, where will the next meal come from or how do I make my mortgage payment, will people be able to really become aesthetic and individualist and cultivate their own individuality and be different from everybody else. And that's a wonderfully paradoxical argument when you often have, the cliche of capitalist individualism versus communist totalitarian, everybody's the same. So, I mean, partly it's just a thing of trying to frame these things in different ways. And again, I ended by talking about science fiction partly because I think science fiction deals with this question of possible or potential futures. It's not saying either this is what we want to happen or that this will inevitably happen. It's trying to express possibility. Sometimes it's a vision of horror of look how we're destroying the environment and look what we're going to end up with. Sometimes it's using that to say, well, are there things we can do with this? Are there other ways we can think about it? Are there other possibilities which can come from it? And it's the two stories I ended with are both very, I think, nuanced in the way they're both stories of catastrophe, but they're neither of them is completely nihilistic or hopeless. And the kind of that's a kind of tonal thing which doesn't come out just in the content of the stories, but also of course in the form of narration and the way they work in their genre and things like that. So it becomes an aesthetic thing. So maybe that's just evading the question of how the change can happen, which I have no idea how it can. But that's I mean, in my own work, that's what I'm looking at, and I'm not. I mean, there's a kind of tendency. There's this weird thing in academia in the last 20 or 30 years, where either on the one hand, people claim my work is revolutionary, and by teaching students such and such, I'm really turning them into revolutionaries or overthrowing the capitalist system. And other people saying, well, since you're a professor, you're earning a comfortable salary, you're living a middle-class life, you have no business saying that there's anything wrong with things since you're benefiting from it. Now, I mean, both of those attitudes seem incredibly puzzling to me, even though you're often given either alternative between the two of them. I mean, I think you can't help, very few people have their heads buried in the sand so much they can avoid feeling some sense of responsibility in terms of looking at the world around them and thinking what's wrong with it and what's right with it and things like that. But that doesn't mean that you're dedicating your whole life to overthrowing the system or something like that either. I mean, that's why I say ultimately, though I have this political side to my work, I'm ultimately would say I'm an aesthete. As a critic, I'm thinking about aesthetic possibilities of life. I mean, that's the best I can do. I don't have any political answers, obviously.
Yeah. But it sounds like halfway to hell might be enough.
Well.
Okay, well, so our session does end at 6:30, so please join me in thanking our...
Thank you all for coming and listening.